We were questioning the use of the term APM stocks on this title slide because we're not sure that many investors know what APM means. Why you may have clicked this presentation is because some of these tickers are familiar. Perhaps you're an investor in one of these firms or you're thinking about investing in them. So today we're going to talk about APM stocks, and let's start by looking at what APM is. So it stands for Application Performance Management, and this is a often used framework provided by Gartner that shows just what application performance management is. And there's 5 buckets here. You could almost separate these into APM applications. So you have this notion of end user experience. That's where you might have some synthetic probes going in there and making sure that all your functionality works, that there's no errors being thrown. Then you have runtime application architecture, where you might be able to assess the impact of changes that you're making in production. Of course, you're never supposed to make changes in production, but those things happen. And you have business transactions, SLAs for the business. So these are service level agreements. If you're somebody at a senior level in any firm, you're responsible for software applications. Software is now ubiquitous in most firms, and SLAs just make sure that your business remains operational with time allocated to do updates and things like that. So it's a minimum uptime requirement sort of thing. Then you have these other bits, analytics reporting and component monitoring. So it isn't that important that we understand the intricacies of APM. When we're looking at SaaS companies, sometimes it doesn't even matter what the SaaS company does because we can focus solely on metrics. However, we believe it does matter because you have firms like Qualtrics that offer experience management, which may not be so durable when it comes time for budget cuts. So when we look at the companies involved in APM, here is Gartner's latest quadrant for what they're saying: application performance monitoring and observability. You're going to see this word observability thrown around, and we're going to talk about that. Now, when we look at the firms here in the leadership quadrant, there's some names that we want to focus on, mainly in the upper right: Datadog, Dynatrace, and New Relic. So some of our paying subscribers have been bringing up these names and asking us to cover them. So that's what we're going to do today, at least at a topical level. So this is a relatively new quadrant from Gartner. And one of the things that we noticed is that if you compare this quadrant to the previous one, there's some interesting changes here. We've highlighted them. So on the left is the quadrant from last year. You can see that Cisco and App Dynamics is a leader, and then you can see that this year they're a challenger. So surprising how that changed so quickly. And then you can see how IBM was a niche player and suddenly they're a leader this year. Reasons for that we don't know, but it just goes to show that these quadrants need to be taken with a grain of salt. The usefulness that we can find is that they allow us to identify key players in this particular niche. In this case, we're interested in looking at 5 APM stocks today. We're going to look at Datadog, Dynatrace, New Relic, Splunk, and Elastic. Now, those last 2 names have something, I'd say they're differentiated between the other 3, and we'll talk about that. But first, here's a look at the size of these firms and their revenues. So when it comes to market cap, you can see that Datadog is quite big, closing in on $35 billion market cap, and Splunk is behind them at over 15. So they're twice the size of Splunk. But then when you look at revenues, Splunk has significantly more revenues than Datadog, which means, of course, that when we look at valuation, so we use what's called a simple valuation ratio, which takes market cap and divides it by annualized revenues. We've done that here, and you can see that Datadog is very richly priced. So that's sort of in the range of a snowflake almost. And then you have Dynatrace going down the list, with New Relic being the more reasonably valued of the lot. Now, valuation is just one metric that we look at when we're assessing companies. But first, let's take a look at Splunk. So of the 5 firms that we're talking about today that you see on this list, we're invested in one of those, and that's partially what prompted this presentation. And I will put in the description of this video the accompanying research piece, which has a lot of links to the information that we're presenting. So Splunk. This is a magic quadrant for what's called SIEM, Security Information and Event Management. And on here, you'll see 3 names that also happen to be on the APM quadrant. You'll see Splunk there, and unfortunately, although Splunk says they've been on this quadrant for 8 years in a row, and they have, they used to be much more in the far upper right, and they seem to be drifting lower and to the left, which is not good. So that's at least based on Gartner's analysis, right? So this is a list of these SIEM firms, and both Elastic and Sumo Logic, that's a company we've covered before. I'll put a link to that research piece in the description of this video. Both Elastic and Sumo Logic are also in this SIEM classification. So the next question is, how does SIEM compare to APM? Now, SIEM is what it says on the tin, Security Information and Event Management. It's pretty much data exhaust from a firm's application. So we put some examples here: database change logs, security access logs, and application event logs. Every application will spit out these event logs that programmers can use to debug problems. So if you were to describe SIEM, you might say that it's the act of collecting all event logs of every type across an organization's technology stack. And then APM, that uses SIEM data as a key input. And then what that means is that SIEM providers can start to begin offering APM tools. And that's exactly what we see happening here. And here's an excerpt from Gartner. They say, Splunk has a large presence in log monitoring and SIEM, which enables it to introduce and cross-sell APM solutions to existing customers. That's great. So now we understand how these two interact. And when we look at firms like Elastic and Splunk and Sumo Logic, I pulled these from their investor decks because they kind of show how they're thinking about it. So on the right, you'll see Elastic describing that word we saw earlier, observability, and putting that under APM. And then you see they talk about Elastic Security, which they classify under SIEM. And then you see these same words being used by Splunk, security and observability. So the language is sometimes quite confusing, but if you start to see patterns, then that helps it make much more sense. Now, when we look at these 3 SIEM stocks, we have Splunk, Elastic, and Sumo Logic. As I said, we've written off Sumo Logic as a firm that we're avoiding. Splunk we love because we're holding it. Elastic we haven't dug into. However, I wanted to point out this excerpt from Gartner that talks about how the SIEM market is characterized by a relatively small number of vendors that have large customer bases. That describes Splunk. Splunk has a lot of enterprise firms. I think they have 90 of the top 100 firms out there. I think in terms of global market cap, something like that, and 690 clients paying them more than $1 million run rate. That's pretty meaningful. So that's why we invested in Splunk, and there are a number of research pieces that we've written because that firm has gone through some drama. But now that we've talked about SIEM and how Splunk, Elastic, and Sumo Logic are differentiated from the 3 leaders that you see here, let's talk about the remaining 3 APM stocks: Datadog, Dynatrace, and New Relic. So the first thing that we might do again is try to pick a leader. We always want to invest in leaders whenever we're looking at a particular niche. Here we've ranked them by market cap. You can see Datadog is significantly bigger than Dynatrace and New Relic. But then when it comes to revenues, you can see that they're more on an even keel. So for the purposes of this presentation, we wanted to look at Datadog versus Dynatrace, and we came across a firm in the UK called Comparatech, and they did that for us. So they said that both of these offerings are in a dead heat. And by the way, Comparatech, that's their job, is to go out there and assess technology offerings. They have around 30 research analysts that do this on a full-time basis. So we assume that what they're saying is fairly accurate. They said that both these offerings are suitable for businesses of all sizes. And this is an important comment. While Dynatrace emphasizes its AI features, Datadog matches that technology. If you recall, The reason that we were attracted to Splunk in the first place is because of all the data exhaust that they were collecting, which they could then feed to AI algorithms. So it's pretty much a given that all 5 APM firms we talked about today are using AI on their big data sets. So this last bullet point here was something that really caught our eye, and it says, those looking for an SIEM system would include Datadog on their list of candidates to investigate, but not Dynatrace. Really? So why wasn't Datadog in the SIEM quadrant from Gartner that was put out last year? We even looked in there. They have runners up, wasn't in their list of runners up either. And of course, they need to publish their updated one for this year. So maybe Datadog will appear on that, or there's some real big reason why they're not. There was some speculation. I had seen a piece by CB Insights, their newsletter, is talking about how there's people speculating as to how you end up in these quadrants and the amount of money that you're paying. And there's a number of features that you need to have. And there's a methodology behind it, and we don't have any desire to dig into that. But this is very curious because if Datadog does SIEM, that makes them a direct competitor to Splunk. We've always looked at this as Splunk having an advantage because of the large number of big clients they have and the fact that they're doing SIEM and then building APM tools on top of that. So that was something we noted. And when we looked at Dynatrace's investment deck, this is how they position their firm compared to some of the other names we've talked about today. And they claim to be superior when it comes to their use of AI. Again, the reason that we were attracted to this niche in the first place. So going back to what Comparatech said, well, they make a point to do more marketing around the superiority of their AI when in fact these other firms, well, at least Datadog, offers something very similar. They just don't talk about it as much. So the question that you might have, certainly some of our readers and subscribers have, is which of these APM stocks would you buy? Well, we broke them out here in terms of survivability. So all have high gross margins, right? There's 2 metrics we look at for survivability lately. That's gross margin and runway, which is the amount of cash you have divided by what you're burning. So we broke out runway because they all have pretty high 70s gross margins. And when it comes to runway, you see Datadog has $1.67 billion in cash, and they burnt about 21 million last year. That's a runway of about 79 years. The point is that they're in no pain at all, regardless of what happens with the bear market that we're currently in. And then you can go down the list. Splunk is, there's a concern there, and you'll have to read our research pieces that describe why we believe that they'll be able to navigate through this. We certainly hope they will. And that's primarily because of the private equity firm that they're working with. And there's a whole, as I said earlier, bit of drama around that, which we've elaborated on in previous research pieces. And then lastly, you have Dynatrace, which is profitable. So burn rate isn't a concern. At least they were profitable over the past 2 years. Although this last quarter, I think they barely eked through profitability, but they have 463 million. So they're in good shape. And I guess when it comes down to which stock to buy, if you weren't holding one and you wanted to enter this domain, you'd probably look at one of the 2 leaders, Datadog or Dynatrace. So just to conclude, we would view these 5 APM stocks plus Sumo Logic as an equivalence class. And in the world of quality assurance, that when you're looking at testing something, if you run a test in an equivalence class, it's the same as running every single test in that set. So for investors, that means if you invest, find a leader in this niche and invest in one, and that's equivalent of investing in the others as well in terms of your exposure. And the other thing here is that we might see some consolidation. A lot of these companies are doing very similar things. And what they all have in common is that their offerings seem durable. And by that, I mean that they're not likely to be displaced by a competitor, or if, let's say, if budgets tighten and they're looking at which expenditures to axe, this APM functionality probably isn't something that's going to go to the chopping block. So these will be durable. And what's nice is that all these firms seem to have amassed a decent client base so that even if companies stop taking calls from vendors, they'll still be able to upsell their additional solutions. A company like Splunk, it can upsell all their enterprise clients these APM offerings. So best thing to do here, pick a name and stick with it and see what happens. So please put your comments in the comments section, subscribe to our channel. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this presentation today.